Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop. So occasionally I like to get out of the world of flat and square and do a little bowl turning. I really enjoy this process because it's a lot of fun to get those shavings flying, and it's a lot more sculptural than a lot of the work that I typically do. So let's head out to the yard, cut off a section of a log, and get turning. I have a bunch of these small logs that I brought home specifically for bowl turning. The first one I'm cutting is a cherry log. For bowl turning, you need a square blank, or in other words, the blank needs to be as long as it is wide, at least to minimize waste. I use the bar of the chainsaw to gauge the length of the cut based on the log's diameter. Next, I'll split the round into two blanks. I'm aiming with the saw to cut through the pith so it's eliminated by the curve of the saw. This little 45cc saw is really great for cutting bowl blanks. You don't really need anything much bigger than something like this. Before I had this gas chainsaw, I used an electric chainsaw which works equally well, just a little slower, but the nice thing about the electric chainsaw is you don't have to worry about maintaining it. There really is nothing to maintain on those things. As long as you have power, the thing will run. While I'm out here, I'm also going to grab a chunk of this box elder, and as you can see, this thing is a lot softer than the cherry that I was previously cutting. This log was sitting around on the forest floor for a while, so it probably rotted a little bit, but I think that bit of rot, as well as the color from the box elder, should produce a really nice bowl. The only problem with these smaller saws is there's not a whole lot of space for the chips to eject, especially when you're pulling these large shavings when you're going with the grain. It tends to get clogged up in the clutch and sprocket area. Alright. So the first thing I want to do is figure out what the biggest piece of material I can get out of this is going to be, because I'm going to cut a rough circle out at the bandsaw with my circle cutting jig. So this one is about 10.5 inches wide and about a foot long. So I know the center point is probably going to be somewhere 6 inches in here and then 5.5 there. So the center point is somewhere in there. And this is a 10-inch circle we'll go for. So I'll move my screw to my 5-inch position, which is this one here. So since this is my shorter dimension, I can use the kerf line here to just kind of eyeball the edge of the board, and then eyeball top to bottom. Scoot up this way a little bit, and I can just screw it down. So I'm just going to spin this around to make sure it's kind of where I want it. Alright, so over to the bandsaw. Alright, so one more thing I'm going to do here with the bandsaw is tilt the table so that I'm cutting more of a conical shape rather than a cylinder. That's just going to save me a little bit more time on the lathe doing some roughing. So with this all set to go, I can turn on the saw and start spinning the bowl blank through the blade to create that kind of conical shape for the bowl blank. Alright, so there's the blank, and to mount it to the lathe I'm going to use a faceplate. And since this is a smaller bowl, I'm not too worried about getting it perfectly centered. It's not that big. On a bigger one, it'd be a little bit more critical, because then you'll have even more wobble to the blank. If you want a really easy way to get this thing centered every single time, which I can't really do because I have this adapter sleeve on my faceplate, is you can take a spade bit that's the same diameter as the inside of the faceplate, and you can line that center spur up with the center hole from your center jig or your circle jig, and then you can line up the faceplate exactly perfectly because you have that center hole alignment. So that can save you a little bit of extra turning on the lathe. For me here, this is pretty easy to get, eyeballed close enough, and then I'll just screw it in. So before I put this thing on the lathe, let's talk about tools and sharpening. Now, majority of all the turning I'm going to do today is going to be with a couple of bowl gouges. These are both 5/8 inch bowl gouges. They're just the inexpensive kinds, and one just happens to be longer than the other one, otherwise they're identical. And the other tool I'm going to use is a skew chisel, and I'm going to use this to clean up the tenon that the chuck is going to grab later on to hold the bowl blank on the lathe. So for sharpening, I have the slow speed grinder, and I have it outfitted with a one-way Wolverine grinding jig. It has a flat platform, and it also has a gouge platform as well. If you use it like this, you have a standard spindle gouge arrangement or a standard grind arrangement. If you get the jig like this, which is what I use, this will actually put a fingernail grind onto your tools, and that's the grind I have on here. So this is a fingernail grind or a Ellsworth grind, and it has the sides of the tool swept back, and you can actually use all of this as cutting area, and these wings here actually work as scrapers really well. So you have a lot of, basically have more than one tool in one tool. It's kind of like a multi-tool in that sense. So on my jig to sharpen these gouges, I have a few little setup blocks so I get a consistent grind every single time. The first thing I have here, this is a pen blank, but it also is my gauge to set how far out the platform is from the wheel. I can lock that in. Now the other little setup block I have is this guy right here, and this is going to set the protrusion of my chisel, or my gouge, sorry, outside of the sweep grinding jig. So I can put the gouge into the jig, I can put it up against this block, and then tighten it down. And now every single time I do this, it's protruding the same amount, so I get exactly the same grind every single time I do this. I'll first grind the two wings of the gouge, and then blend the two wings together at the tip. I'll bring the speed of the lathe up until the whole lathe starts to shake from the unbalanced blank, and then I'll turn the speed down just a little bit, just to make it a little more stable. I'm going to start off with some facing cuts to bring this bottom section of the bowl into round. So here I'm using just the wings of the gouge, and I'm doing a pull cut, pulling the gouge towards me and using those wings to remove the material. The more material I remove from this base here, the truer the blank will run, and therefore the faster I can have the lathe spin, which will make the whole turning process go faster and faster, because as that bowl spins faster, it's traveling past that cutter more frequently, and then more material can be removed. So once I have the bottom pretty well trued up, I can start working on the sides, and here I'm going to use a push cut. I'm going to ride the bevel of the gouge against the bowl and push through the cut. This will produce some really nice long shavings. Next, I'll start blending the two together, trying to make a nice even transition between the base and the side of the bowl. And now to help clean up some of the tear out and make it really easy to see what the bowl is going to look like, I'll go over the entire thing with a push cut. This will leave me with a really nice clean surface and will remove a lot of the tear out I had from all those pull cuts. It's really not that necessary to have a super clean looking bowl at this point, since this is just roughing, but I like to have a cleaned up surface that kind of gives you a nice preview of what it's going to look like. With the push cut, you have a lot of control over the cut, and it leaves you with a really clean, smooth surface. And you can vary that cut depth as much as you want. You can do a pretty heavy cut with this, or you can do a really, really fine finishing cut as well. So once I'm happy with the overall shape of the bowl, I can start working on a tenon on the base that my chuck can grab. On smaller bowls like this, I'll turn a tenon on the end, and on longer ones, I'll make a recess and expand the jaws of the chuck into the recess and hold the bowl that way. I'll set a pair of dividers to the same width as the jaws of my chuck so I know what size tenon to turn on the base of the bowl. I'll plunge the bowl gouge in to create the tenon, and then I'll use the skew chisel to clean up that inside corner to create a nice clean shoulder for the chuck. Now I can grab the tenon with the chuck. I'll bring the tailstock in just to hold the chuck in place and put pressure against it so it's nice and tight against the bowl, and so it makes it really easy to just attach this thing. I can then unscrew the faceplate from the headstock. Then I'll bring the tailstock back in to hold the whole thing as I'm pulling it off so it doesn't fall off on me. Next I can remove the screws, and then I can reinstall the bowl blank back on the lathe with the chuck in the headstock. Before I start hollowing the bowl, I'll true the face of the blank so that it runs true on the lathe. I prefer to do push cuts for the hollowing. I start out a little from the center, pick up a shaving and push the gouge to the center of the bowl, right in the bevel of the gouge on the bowl. On the next cut, I'll start a little further out, pick up a shaving and ride all the way to the center again. It's more obvious the further I get out from the center of how I'm swinging the handles to create a cut that sweeps down the side of the bowl and into the bottom. A really great way to do this cut if you're new to it or you're just feeling lazy is to rest the end of the gouge on the lathe bed. This gives you a ton of control and eliminates one of the variables and allows you to focus on guiding the tool through the cut. The last thing I do is work on the transition area between the walls and the bottom of the bowl. I'm working this area so the inside shape of the bowl matches the outside profile, leaving me with an even wall thickness. Coming through this transition area is where you're most likely to get a catch with a bowl gouge. So if you're new to using a bowl gouge, just be careful as you're coming through this area so you don't end up with 2 points of contact. So now that the bowl is rough turned, it's still really wet and needs to dry. So to do that, I stick it into a paper bag, and that just makes it dry a little slower and a little more evenly because the end grain section of the bowl is going to dry faster than the side grain, and if that happens, it could crack. So putting it in the bag is a great way to kind of slow things down and make sure the bowl doesn't end up cracking on you. You can also coat them in anchor seal or any other sealing product, or you can actually add some shavings to the bag as well. That could help to slow things down. And it also depends on where you're going to put that bag. I usually leave the bowls in the bag for maybe 3 weeks or so, and if I remember to take them out, usually I don't because I don't do it very often. I have a lot of these roughed out laying around ready to be finished turned. So they'll end up being in the bag for a lot longer, but if I'm trying to get it done really quickly, maybe 3 weeks or so in the bag, and then maybe a few months sitting out on the shelf to dry. Again, it depends on where you're drying these things. All my stuff's in my basement, so it's pretty dry in there. Things typically dry pretty quickly. That time is also going to vary depending on the wall thickness of the bowl you go with. Most of my stuff ends up being around an inch or so thick. I tend to leave things a little thicker. That way, if it does warp a lot, I still have a lot more material to turn back and get back to a round form. So speaking of the round form, that's one of the reasons why we rough turn the bowls first and then let them dry, because they will warp. So here's a pretty exaggerated example. The bigger ones are more obvious, but this used to be round, but as you can see, the inside diameter here is now different than the inside diameter here. In this direction here, it's about 10 and a quarter inches or so, and this way it's about 11 now. So it does warp, and by turning it first and allowing it to warp, you can then get it back into a round form that will stay round. So the other reason for rough turning is the dry time. So this might not be that big of a deal for something that's maybe 2 or 3 inches deep, but when you get to something that's 6 inches, 8 inches deep, if you were to try it and dry a whole block of wood like that, that's going to take you a few years just to get that block of wood dry enough so that it is dry all the way through. Whereas like this, you can get this thing rough turned into something about an inch thick and have it dried in a few months and ready to go. So I definitely would not call myself a turner. I've only done this a couple hundred times and I don't do it really that often. So if you're looking for more information on turning in general, spindle turning or bowl turning like I showed today, check out a lot of the great content here on YouTube. There's a ton of videos on turning and it's like a whole nother thing. There's tons of information about it. So thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments about anything I talked about today with the turning or anything here in my shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. As always, I appreciate those and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.